Imagine for a moment as a child that your emotions were too much. Your needs were always a burden. Your desires felt like a threat. You learned early on that to be loved, to be accepted, you had to shrink yourself, to disappear into the background and make space for others. You became the healer, the peacekeeper, the one who absorbed everyone else's pain, because that was the only way to keep the storm from breaking out. The idea of being selfish was never a luxury, it was a taboo. This is the world of an empath, a person whose gift for caring for others isn't born from some mystical source, but is instead a survival mechanism. The deep, overwhelming need to fix everything around you, to absorb the emotional weight of others, to take on their pain. This is not a divine gift, as many think. This is survival programming from a childhood where your feelings were too loud, your needs were too much, and your very existence seemed to depend on serving others. Carl Jung, one of the most profound psychological minds of our time, revealed that the empath is essentially the child who was never allowed to be selfish. You were taught that your emotional world was too overwhelming, too dangerous. Your true self, the one that wanted, that demanded, that needed, had to be suppressed in order to survive. You learned to read others, to sense their needs before they even spoke them. You absorbed their emotions like a sponge because you were taught that your own feelings, your own desires, would only create tension. This hypervigilance is what Jung identified as a form of survival adaptation in children raised in emotionally volatile environments. But here's where Jung's revolutionary insight changes everything. Empaths are not broken. Far from it. Jung saw them as halfway through the process of individuation, the psychological journey of becoming a whole person. He didn't see your ability to care as something wrong or defective. Rather, it's the result of an unconscious process that's still unfolding within you. It's the sign that you've learned how to survive by becoming deeply attuned to the emotions of others, but it's also the sign that you are in the process of awakening to your authentic self, the part of you that was sacrificed for survival, the part that is just beginning to emerge. That's where the real transformation begins because deep down, you've always known that this overwhelming need to absorb others' emotions, to fix things, to disappear, came at a cost. It wasn't a spiritual gift, it was a survival strategy. Your sensitivity, your hyper awareness of everyone around you, wasn't just a talent, it was a method of coping, an instinctive response to the emotional unpredictability of your childhood. Jung's insight isn't about diminishing your capacity for empathy. It's about unlocking it in a way that allows you to choose when and how to give your energy. This transformation isn't about becoming less sensitive, less caring. It's about becoming more conscious of your choices. It's about reclaiming your power and your authenticity by integrating the parts of yourself you had to suppress. This is the essence of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming the person you were always meant to be, not the version of yourself that had to remain small to keep others comfortable. In this process of individuation, empaths must confront a paradox. Your sensitivity is both a gift and a burden. Jung knew this well. The empath's sensitivity, honed over years of survival, becomes the very thing that prevents you from truly knowing yourself. You are a master at reading the emotional world of others, but you remain a stranger to your own emotional landscape. The same sensitivity that made you an emotional barometer for others became the barrier that stopped you from identifying your own needs, your own desires, and your own boundaries. For years, you may have felt that your empathy came at an unspoken cost, a cost that you couldn't name, but that you could always feel. The act of taking on the emotions of others became so second nature that you never questioned it. It wasn't until recently, perhaps, that you began to realize something more profound, that the price of your empathy was your own sense of self. Jung understood that to move from this compulsion to a place of conscious choice requires you to reconnect with your authentic self, the part of you that was suppressed in order to keep the peace. So let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered why it feels so exhausting to be always there for others? Why it sometimes feels like giving everything you have but getting nothing in return? This isn't because you're broken or flawed, it's because you're being asked by your very psyche to reclaim the balance between caring for others and caring for yourself. Jung's revolutionary idea was that empaths must first learn to care for themselves in the same way they care for others. And that's where the journey begins. Jung's final message to the empath is clear. Your sensitivity was never a flaw. It was the result of survival programming from childhood. But now, as you move through the process of individuation, you have the chance to transform your gift from compulsion to conscious choice, to stop being the child who could never be selfish, and to begin the journey of becoming the adult who has the right to exist, to desire, and to take care of themselves just as much as they take care of others. Your sensitivity isn't the problem. The problem is that it has been used unconsciously to survive. The solution is to reclaim it as a conscious choice, a gift that you offer not because you have to, but because you choose to. If you're still reading this, it means you've already begun to feel the weight of the revelation. Your sensitivity is not the curse you once believed it to be. In fact, it is the very thing that, when integrated and understood, has the potential to become your greatest strength. But here's the truth you may not want to hear. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey, one that requires patience, courage, and most importantly, the willingness to confront the parts of yourself that you've kept hidden for so long. This is where Carl Jung's concept of individuation comes into play. Jung saw individuation as the process of becoming the person you truly are, not the person you had to become to survive in the world. It's a deep, often painful process of integration where you make conscious the parts of yourself that you've been disconnected from, parts of you that were repressed, rejected, or ignored. For the empath, this includes not only your sensitivity, but also the parts of your identity that you suppressed in order to serve others, your needs, your desires, and your right to take up space. The empathic process of individuation is unique because it involves not just the integration of hidden parts of the self, but also the conscious transformation of your empathic sensitivity from a survival mechanism into a conscious choice. For years, your sensitivity was an unconscious response to the emotional needs of others. It kept you safe by allowing you to read the emotional landscape of those around you before they even had a chance to speak. You were the emotional barometer of the family, the friend, the partner, the one who could always sense when something was wrong, who could pick up on every shift in mood, every change in the atmosphere. But now, Jung would argue, it's time for that same sensitivity to become something more, something deeper, something more empowering. In the process of individuation, the empath begins to wake up to their own inner world, a world that has been neglected for so long. You begin to realize that the same sensitivity that allows you to pick up on the emotions of others has, in the past, prevented you from truly connecting with yourself. The emotional space you created for others was also the space in which you lost yourself. You may have spent years serving others, sacrificing your own needs, trying to fix others, trying to make everyone else feel comfortable. Yet, deep inside, there was a quiet voice that wondered, what about me? The awakening of that voice is the first step in the process of individuation for the empath. It's not about rejecting the gift of empathy. It's about reclaiming it as something you use consciously, not unconsciously. It's about learning to listen to your own needs with the same attentiveness and care that you give to the needs of others. It's about recognizing that you have just as much right to care for yourself, to set boundaries, and to create space for your own emotional well-being. This process can feel unsettling at first. After all, for so long, you've been the one who absorbs others' emotions, who takes on the weight of the world. The idea of placing yourself first, of setting boundaries that protect your energy, might feel like betrayal, not just to others, but to the person you have been. You may even feel guilty for the very act of prioritizing your own needs. After all, isn't empathy supposed to be about selflessness? Jung's insight into this is profoundly liberating. He understood that selflessness does not mean neglecting oneself. True selflessness comes from a place of strength, not weakness. It is about choosing when and how to give, rather than giving because you feel obligated or because you fear that without your support, others will fall apart. It is about self-respect, about learning that your well-being is just as important as anyone else's. Jung believed that when you truly care for yourself, you are better able to care for others, not from a place of depletion, but from a place of fullness. This is the true meaning of sacred selfishness, a concept that Jung championed. It's not about being selfish in a negative, self-absorbed way. It's about having the right to exist, to take up space, to prioritize your own emotional health. When you do this, you reclaim the very energy that once went into others' needs and turn it inward. Sacred selfishness is about giving yourself permission to be as whole and complete as the people you've spent your life caring for. In the process of individuation, you begin to understand that your gift of empathy isn't a burden. It's an extraordinary tool that, when wielded consciously, can be used to heal both yourself and others. But to do that, you first have to learn to acknowledge your own needs. You have to recognize that the emotional energy you give to others must come from a well that is full, not one that is empty and dry. This is where things get complicated. For so long, you've operated from a place of emotional hypervigilance, a survival mechanism learned in childhood. Your brain has been trained to respond to the emotional needs of others before you could even articulate your own. You've become so attuned to what others feel that you've neglected what you feel. You've become a master at interpreting the emotions of others, but a stranger to your own emotional world. Jung would argue that the goal of individuation is to reconnect with that forgotten self, the one who has its own feelings, its own desires, its own needs, and to integrate this self into the whole of who you are. Only then can you truly begin to experience the world from a place of emotional sovereignty. You no longer give because you feel you have to. You give because you choose to. You care for others because you are first caring for yourself. Imagine this. You've spent your entire life giving your time, your energy, your emotions, your love. You've been the caretaker, the listener, the one who fixes. And yet, despite all that giving, there are moments when you feel empty. You've poured everything into others, but there's nothing left for yourself. And in these moments, you feel both exhausted and guilty. Why? Because you've been taught that self-care is selfish, and that if you're not giving, you're somehow failing. The concept of selfishness has been warped in your mind, turned into something negative, something shameful. But here's where Carl Jung's concept of sacred selfishness enters the picture, a key that can unlock your true potential. Sacred selfishness is not the type of selfishness that dismisses others or ignores their needs. It's not about cutting people off or becoming indifferent. Instead, it's a conscious act of taking care of yourself first, so that you can give from a place of abundance, not depletion. It's about realizing that you matter and that your emotional well-being is just as important as everyone else's. For so long, you've been the person who absorbs the pain of others, who bends over backward to help, to make others feel heard and seen, while your own needs remain unmet. You may have even found comfort in being the one people depend on. It gave you a sense of purpose. But what Jung realized is that this is where the paradox of empathy comes into play. The more you give without boundaries, the more you drain yourself, and eventually this leads to resentment and burnout. You can't pour from an empty cup, and yet you've learned to ignore your cup's emptiness, thinking it's selfish to fill it up. Here's the crux of the issue. Empathy without boundaries is not a gift. It's an unconscious compulsion. It's a response to a childhood where your worth was based on what you could give, on how much you could serve others. In the deepest parts of your mind, you may still carry the belief that your worth depends on how much you give. But here's what Jung showed us. Your value does not come from serving others at the expense of yourself. This is the turning point for the empath, the moment when you realize that self care is not selfishness. It's necessary, it's essential, and it's sacred. It's about learning that your needs are just as valid as anyone else's, and that it's okay to say no when something doesn't serve your well being. Jung's concept of sacred selfishness involves recognizing that you are worthy of love, care, and attention, not because you're perfect or self sacrificing, but because you exist. Your very being is worthy of respect, of space, of nurturing. And when you learn to respect your own boundaries, you can give to others in a way that is sustainable, healthy, and compassionate. Let's break this down. Boundaries are the first step to reclaiming sacred selfishness. Setting healthy boundaries doesn't mean you love others any less. It means you love yourself enough to recognize your limits. Think about it like this. When you build a house, you don't just focus on the walls. You also pay attention to the foundation. Boundaries are your emotional foundation. They are the structural limits that protect your energy, your peace, and your mental well-being. And once you begin to build these emotional walls, you create a safe space where your empathy can flourish in a healthy, conscious way. Jung believed that the true empath, the one who has gone through the process of individuation, understands the difference between caring for others and carrying their burdens. Caring for others means offering your support and compassion, while carrying their burdens means absorbing their pain, taking on their struggles as your own. This is where the healthy empath learns to detach from others' pain without abandoning them. You can feel compassion without being consumed by it. You can offer a listening ear without losing yourself in the conversation. Now, this isn't easy. It's going to feel strange at first, especially when you're used to responding to the emotional needs of others immediately and instinctively. But once you begin to practice sacred selfishness, you will notice a shift. You'll start to feel more grounded, more balanced, and more whole. You'll find that you can still care for others deeply, but you no longer do it at the expense of your own emotional health. You'll realize that when you set boundaries, you not only honor your own needs, but you also create space for authentic connection with others. You will be able to love and support people without losing yourself in the process. This is where the real transformation happens. You start to give to others out of choice, not out of obligation. You give because you have the energy to, because you genuinely want to, not because you feel guilty or because you fear letting someone down. When you practice sacred selfishness, you reclaim your energy, your time, and your love, and then you have the ability to share those gifts freely and willingly. Jung's message is incredibly empowering. You don't have to sacrifice yourself to love others. Sacred selfishness is about reclaiming your autonomy, your right to take up space, to have needs, and to honor those needs without guilt. It's not about being cruel or distant. It's about being strong enough to recognize when you are giving too much and when it's time to refill your own cup. The empath who has learned sacred selfishness is the empath who can truly love others from a place of inner strength, not from emotional depletion. For so long, you may have believed that your value came from your ability to help others, to always be there, to fix what was broken. But Jung's insight helps you see that your value lies in your wholeness. And it is through cultivating this inner wholeness that you can finally experience what it means to give from a place of overflow, not from emptying yourself for others, but from a place of genuine conscious choice. As you continue along the path of individuation, something powerful and often unsettling begins to emerge from the depths of your psyche: the shadow. Carl Jung described the shadow as the parts of the self that we've denied, suppressed, or rejected because they were deemed unacceptable or undesirable by ourselves or society. For the empath, the shadow is particularly significant as it often holds the very traits that were pushed away in the name of survival, traits that we were taught were wrong or selfish. These are the very parts of us that, when integrated, hold the key to becoming a whole, fully realized individual. When you first begin the work of confronting your shadow, it can feel like unearthing a part of you that you've spent your entire life trying to avoid. The shadow is not some external force, it resides within you. It is the collection of all the things you've been taught to repress: your anger, your needs, your desire for respect, your capacity to set boundaries. These qualities were once deemed unworthy of expression, so they were buried deep beneath layers of self sacrifice and people pleasing. But here's the truth: those parts of you are not bad. They are simply misunderstood aspects of your humanity, waiting for recognition and integration. Jung understood that the shadow is not to be feared, but embraced. It contains the energies and traits that, when left unacknowledged, can manifest in unhealthy ways, such as resentment, passive aggression, or burnout. But when integrated, they become sources of immense power and clarity. For the empath, the shadow may contain the forbidden selfishness we've already discussed: our right to say no, to prioritize ourselves, to feel anger, or even to demand respect. These are the very qualities that are often overlooked by those who have spent their lives living for others. It's easy to see how an empath, someone whose life's purpose has often been to serve, love, and take care of others, would struggle with the idea of anger or selfishness. These emotions feel foreign, even wrong. However, as you move further along the journey of individuation, you begin to realize that it is precisely these repressed qualities that must be acknowledged for you to become whole. Jung believed that integration of the shadow doesn't mean acting out its repressed tendencies unconsciously. It means bringing them into awareness so they can be accepted and made part of the conscious self. When you begin to see your shadow not as an enemy to be fought, but as a part of you that deserves recognition, you start to reclaim your personal power. You begin to realize that your right to boundaries, your right to anger, your right to say no without guilt are not weaknesses. They are strengths that help protect your energy and maintain your mental health. This journey of shadow work is not easy. It requires a level of honesty that can be confronting. But it's in this confrontation that you begin to access the hidden gifts that the shadow holds. For example, when you begin to recognize your anger, something that you may have repressed for years, you realize that it's not a destructive force. Anger can be a powerful motivator for change. It's a signal that something in your life is out of balance or unjust. By embracing your anger, you learn to use it as a tool for self advocacy rather than allowing it to turn into passive resentment or emotional burnout. Likewise, your selfishness, the part of you that has been taught to always think of others first, starts to transform. Instead of seeing it as a flaw, you begin to understand that self care is essential to your well being. When you acknowledge that your needs are just as valid as anyone else's, and that your right to prioritize yourself is not only acceptable but necessary, you begin to experience a deeper sense of emotional sovereignty. This is where true freedom lies, in the ability to give and receive love without fear, guilt, or self sacrifice. For the empath, the shadow work is not just about acknowledging anger or selfishness. It's also about confronting the deep guilt that many empaths carry: the guilt of wanting to put themselves first, of taking time for themselves without immediately feeling like they owe something to others. Guilt often arises when we're faced with the reality that we have been conditioned to put everyone else's needs ahead of our own. The good news is that this guilt is a sign of progress, not failure. The fact that you're able to recognize the guilt means you're on the right track, actively dismantling the belief that you must always sacrifice yourself for others. The empath who successfully confronts and integrates their shadow doesn't lose their compassion or their empathy. In fact, they become more authentically compassionate. Instead of giving out of a sense of obligation or fear of rejection, they give because they choose to, because they have the energy and capacity to do so without losing themselves in the process. This is what Jung referred to as achieving wholeness, the ability to hold and integrate both light and dark, both strength and vulnerability without judgment. Through this process of integration, you begin to realize that the shadow is not something to be feared or repressed. It is a vital part of your journey toward authenticity. By allowing yourself to feel anger, to say no, to demand respect, you open the door to freedom. This freedom comes from understanding that you no longer have to hide parts of yourself to fit into the mold others have created for you. Instead, you begin to live according to your own standards, not based on what others need or expect from you. You no longer apologize for your existence. You no longer feel guilty for taking care of yourself. This is the individuated empath, someone who has integrated the shadow, embraced their true self, and learned to use their empathy as a conscious gift, not as a survival mechanism. They can love deeply, care for others, and feel compassion without losing themselves in the process. They understand that their emotional energy is a precious resource, and they treat it with the respect it deserves. As you continue to move deeper into the process of individuation, another crucial step emerges: learning to prioritize yourself. This may sound like a simple concept, but for an empath, it's often one of the most difficult hurdles to overcome. The journey towards self prioritization isn't just about learning to say no to others, it's about overcoming the deep seated guilt that arises when you take time for yourself. It's about confronting the beliefs that have been ingrained in you since childhood, the beliefs that your needs are less important, that self sacrifice is virtuous, and that to be loved, you must be constantly giving to others. This guilt is powerful because it's tied to your sense of self worth. For so long, you've been conditioned to believe that your value is measured by how much you can give to others, how much you can sacrifice, how much you can carry their burdens. This conditioning runs so deep that the very idea of taking a step back, of focusing on your own needs, can feel like an act of betrayal. It's as if you are turning your back on everything you've been taught is noble and good. But here's the truth: that guilt is not your true self speaking. It's the false self you've created in response to the world's expectations of you. Carl Jung understood this struggle intimately. He recognized that the path to true psychological health required not just the integration of the shadow, but also the development of psychological courage, the courage to be yourself, to face the discomfort of changing old patterns, and to start honoring your own needs. And this, perhaps more than anything, is what the empath needs to learn: to honor yourself without feeling guilty, to give to yourself as generously as you give to others, without the fear of being labeled as selfish or uncaring. The first step in overcoming this guilt is recognizing that it is rooted in old survival mechanisms. As a child, you learned that your emotional survival depended on meeting the needs of others. Your feelings were dismissed, ignored, or minimized, and you had to find ways to adapt. You learned to read others, anticipate their needs, and adjust your behavior accordingly. Your emotional well being took a back seat because it was safer to keep others comfortable. In fact, it felt like love, like you were earning love by being there for others, by sacrificing yourself for them. But now, as an adult on the path of individuation, you're learning that true love, real healthy love, is not about self neglect. It's about mutual respect. It's about balance. It's about understanding that your needs are just as important as anyone else's. And when you finally allow yourself to prioritize your own emotional health, you will see that it does not diminish your ability to care for others, it enhances it. This is where the concept of emotional sovereignty comes into play. Jung believed that emotional sovereignty was one of the highest forms of psychological health. To be emotionally sovereign is to own your feelings, to accept your needs, and to set boundaries that honor both your inner world and the outer world. It's about recognizing that you are not responsible for carrying the emotional weight of others and that your well being does not depend on how much you give or how much you sacrifice. In practical terms, emotional sovereignty means learning to stop apologizing for your needs. It means understanding that you do not have to explain yourself or justify why you need space, time, or energy to replenish yourself. This is not a selfish act, it's a necessary one. Without it, you risk losing your ability to give at all. Without honoring your own needs, you become an empty vessel, emotionally drained, physically exhausted, and mentally depleted. And when you reach this point, your ability to empathize, to care, and to love others becomes compromised. The very gift you want to give becomes a burden. Here's the challenge. Embracing your own needs requires deep self compassion. You must begin to see yourself not as a tool for others' comfort, but as a whole, valuable human being in your own right. This is where the most profound healing begins. Not when you learn to give less to others, but when you learn to give to yourself as well. You begin to see that self prioritization isn't a betrayal, it's an act of radical self respect. But the road to this realization isn't smooth. Guilt will come up again and again. You may feel like you're being selfish, that others will see you as cold or uncaring, that you're abandoning your role as the caretaker. You might even feel guilty for taking time for yourself, for setting boundaries that protect your emotional energy. But Jung would tell you that this guilt is not your true self speaking. It's the remnants of old conditioning, the false self that learned to live for others instead of for itself. As you face this guilt, you begin to recognize that it's a reflection of the old narrative you've carried for so long. The narrative that says your worth comes from what you can do for others, not from simply being. But now, as you heal, you realize that the most valuable thing you can offer the world is not your constant self sacrifice, it's your wholeness. When you honor your own needs, you create the space to be the most authentic version of yourself. And when you show up as your full, authentic self, you become a beacon of strength, compassion, and true love for others. Jung's process of individuation, the journey of becoming your true self, requires not just the shedding of the old ways of being, but the courage to face and transform the deep emotional habits and beliefs that no longer serve you. For the empath, this means confronting the deeply embedded belief that love must be earned through self sacrifice and emotional labor. It means learning to give to yourself in the same way you've always given to others, with compassion, understanding, and grace. As you do this, the guilt begins to fade. You start to recognize it for what it is, a vestige of an old survival strategy, not a truth. You start to feel the power that comes from reclaiming your energy, the power to set boundaries, to protect your peace, to nurture your own soul. And in doing so, you find that the more you prioritize yourself, the more freely and authentically you can give to others, not because you have to, but because you want to. This is what true emotional sovereignty looks like: the ability to choose when and how to give your energy, your time, your love, without guilt, without self sacrifice, and with the full recognition that your needs are just as important as anyone else's. As you deepen into the journey of individuation, another crucial concept starts to surface: the idea of boundaries. If you've been following along, you may have already experienced moments of tension around the notion of self care and self prioritization. Setting boundaries, those invisible lines that protect your emotional, mental, and physical well being, might seem like an obvious step. But for many empaths, it's a completely new territory. For years, you may have lived without clear boundaries, navigating relationships by instinct. You've learned to absorb the emotions of others, to feel their needs before they even speak, to adapt yourself to fit the expectations of those around you. In some cases, you may have felt that your identity was inextricably tied to serving others, to becoming whatever they needed you to be. The idea of asserting boundaries may feel uncomfortable or even guilt-ridden because, for so long, you were taught that love meant endless giving, unquestioning availability, and emotional self-sacrifice. Jung understood that the journey toward becoming a whole individual requires learning to recognize where you end and others begin, something many empaths struggle with. The empath's journey toward individuation isn't just about discovering the parts of themselves they have repressed. It's also about reclaiming their sense of self in the face of the emotional expectations of others. And boundaries are what allow you to do this. Boundaries are not just a way of protecting yourself. They are a form of self respect. They are your acknowledgement that your needs, your emotions, and your space are just as valid as anyone else's. Think of boundaries as the walls of your emotional home. If you don't have walls, your emotional space is wide open, leaving you vulnerable to emotional intrusions from others. Boundaries define the perimeter of your emotional world, setting limits on what you're willing to give and take in relationships. When you set clear boundaries, you protect your energy, your time, and your mental well being. And just as important, you also create the conditions for authentic connection with others. Because here's the paradox: true intimacy, true connection, cannot exist without healthy boundaries. Empaths often struggle with boundaries because they are so attuned to the emotions of others. They feel responsible for others' happiness, and as a result, they allow their boundaries to become porous. Over time, this leads to what Jung called self-abandonment, the process of losing yourself in the needs and desires of others. You might have lost track of your own wants and needs because you were too busy meeting the expectations of everyone around you. Here's where the power of boundaries becomes clear. Boundaries are not walls that separate you from others. They are gates that allow you to choose who and what you let in. When you start to establish and enforce boundaries, you begin to operate from a place of choice rather than obligation. You begin to choose what relationships are nourishing and which ones drain you. You begin to choose what to give and what to keep for yourself. But let's be real for a moment. Learning to set boundaries isn't easy. It's not as simple as saying no and expecting the world to adjust. There is emotional work involved, work that may bring up discomfort, guilt, and even resistance from others. If you've spent years being the caretaker, the one who says yes to everything, setting a boundary can feel like a betrayal. Others may push back against your new limits because they've become accustomed to your constant availability. But Jung's wisdom shines here. The resistance you face from others is a sign of your growth. It shows you that you are reclaiming your power, your space, and your right to exist as an individual. Here's the key to remember: setting boundaries is not about being cruel or shutting people out. It's about honoring yourself so that you can show up for others in a way that is authentic and sustainable. It's about understanding that your worth is not defined by your ability to constantly give, to constantly be on. Your worth is intrinsic, and your needs are just as important as anyone else's. Boundaries are your permission slip to take care of yourself, and in doing so, they allow you to show up for others from a place of strength and wholeness. As you begin to set boundaries, you'll notice something remarkable. Your relationships will begin to change. Some people will resist your new boundaries, and that's okay. Not everyone will understand, but others will recognize the shift, and those relationships will deepen. You will start to attract people who respect your boundaries, people who honor your emotional sovereignty. Authentic connections are always rooted in mutual respect, and healthy boundaries create the space for that respect to flourish. You may also notice that the more you set boundaries, the more empowered you feel. The guilt you once felt when saying no will gradually transform into a sense of relief as you realize that you're honoring yourself for the first time in a long time. The more you practice setting healthy boundaries, the more you will understand that boundaries are not walls of defense. They are the sacred space within which true connection can happen. And here's the beautiful paradox: boundaries don't push people away, they bring people closer. When you set boundaries, you are essentially telling others, I value myself and I value you enough to be authentic with you. You stop pretending to be someone you're not, and in doing so, you create the conditions for the deepest, most fulfilling relationships to unfold. Boundaries allow you to be the most authentic version of yourself, and it's from this place of authenticity that true intimacy and connection can arise. So, as you move forward, remember this: boundaries are the foundation of healthy, sustainable relationships. They are not about rejection, they are about creating the emotional space for mutual respect and authentic connection. You don't need to sacrifice yourself for the sake of others. You have the right to honor your emotional needs. And in doing so, you will find that your relationships will be more meaningful, more fulfilling, and ultimately more in alignment with your true self. As you reach the final stage of your individuation journey, you begin to experience something profound, a shift that integrates everything you've learned so far. This stage is where all of your hard work, your struggles with boundaries, your confrontations with guilt, and your willingness to embrace your shadow all begin to merge into something deeply transformative. This is the point where your empathy and your self care cease to exist as opposing forces, and instead, they become two sides of the same coin. This is where you finally realize the deeper truth that Carl Jung has been trying to teach you all along. True empathy comes from a place of integration, not self sacrifice. Jung referred to this state of integration as the transcendent function, a psychological mechanism that allows you to bridge opposing forces within yourself and transform them into something greater. It's the process of holding the tension between what seems like conflicting emotions or desires, and instead of allowing them to tear you apart, you allow them to coalesce into a more complete, authentic self. For the empath, this means reconciling your deep empathy with the necessary self care that enables you to sustain that empathy in healthy ways. Throughout your life, you've likely lived in a world of extremes. On one hand, the overwhelming need to help others, and on the other, the guilt and exhaustion that comes from neglecting your own needs. This emotional tug of war has made it nearly impossible to reconcile these two parts of yourself. You might have felt that being truly empathic meant giving up your own needs entirely, that to love others deeply, you had to lose yourself. But Jung's transcendent function teaches you something entirely different. True empathy is not about disappearing for others. It's about choosing to give from a place of wholeness. The transcendent function operates when you allow both the selfless and the selfish aspects of your nature to coexist, to be integrated into your psyche. It's not about rejecting your empathic nature or rejecting your need for self care. It's about understanding that you are both a compassionate caregiver and a person who deserves love, attention, and rest. By integrating these seemingly opposite forces, you create a psychological and emotional balance that makes your empathy a conscious, powerful choice rather than an unconscious compulsion. Here's the powerful realization: when you allow yourself to exist fully and authentically, you actually become a better empath. When you embrace your right to self care, your ability to empathize with others becomes clearer, deeper, and more compassionate. You no longer give out of obligation or guilt. You give because you choose to, because you have the energy and emotional capacity to do so from a place of inner strength. This is the result of integrating the transcendent function, the ability to hold your empathy and your self care in balance without allowing one to overwhelm the other. This is where the hero's journey of the empath comes to its most profound conclusion. The struggle between giving to others and caring for yourself, between self sacrifice and self respect, has been resolved. You no longer have to choose between being kind to others and being kind to yourself. Instead, you realize that the two are interconnected. Your ability to care for yourself directly enhances your ability to care for others. One of the most beautiful parts of this transformation is that you no longer fear your own emotional needs. You no longer see your desire for rest, for boundaries, for personal time as selfish. Instead, you recognize them as vital components of your well being. These needs are just as legitimate as the needs of the people you love and care for. You no longer have to justify them or feel guilty for prioritizing them. By practicing self compassion, you free yourself from the internal battle that has always held you back. Jung understood that the integration of opposites within the psyche, the empath and the self caretaker, the giver and the receiver, is what leads to wholeness. And wholeness is not about perfection, it's about acceptance. It's about embracing all parts of yourself, even the parts that were once deemed unacceptable. As an empath, this means accepting that you can feel deeply, that you can love intensely, and that you can also take time for yourself. This integration is the true path to freedom. For many empaths, there comes a moment of profound liberation when they realize that they can be both deeply compassionate and fiercely protective of their own energy. They no longer need to apologize for their needs or feel guilty for setting boundaries. They understand that when they honor their own well being, they are not only helping themselves, they are creating the conditions to help others from a place of strength. Now imagine this: you are no longer at war with yourself. You no longer feel torn between self care and self sacrifice. You move through the world with a sense of peace, knowing that your empathy is a conscious choice and that you have the right to choose when and how to give. Your relationships become more fulfilling because you are no longer disappearing into them. You are engaging in them from a place of authentic presence, knowing that your worth is not defined by how much you give, but by who you are. You begin to see that your sensitivity is not a weakness, it is your strength. The depth of your feeling, the clarity of your perception, the compassion you offer are not burdens but gifts, and they are yours to give consciously with boundaries that honor your energy and your worth. This is the integrated empath, the one who has reconciled the two halves of themselves, the one who has learned to balance compassion with self care, to give from fullness rather than depletion. And this, according to Jung, is the ultimate goal of individuation: to become whole, to be fully yourself, embracing both light and shadow, both empathy and self love,